This video has been brought to you by the generous channel members and lads over at Patreon. Thank you all for supporting me and my content. The Russian Revolution is widely considered as one of the most significant events of the 20th century. It was a triumph for Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who successfully overthrew the provisional government and established the world's first proletarian government. This landmark event marked the beginning of the global spread of communism. The revolution, despite its impact on history, has been shrouded in many misconceptions and myths. In popular accounts, the blame for the revolution is placed solely on the Tsarist autocracy and Nicholas II. According to this view, the Tsar's supposed decisions created a path for Lenin to take power. But as I delved deeper into my research, I discovered that the Tsar and the monarchy were not the main cause of the revolution at all. Rather than a popular uprising, I believe Lenin's revolution was chiefly the result of his skillful exploitation of Russia's political climate at that time. Specifically, Lenin capitalized on the instability created by the provisional Russian government in the aftermath of the February Revolution. But to truly understand the roots of the revolution, we must look beyond the provisional government and focus on the one figure who, through his own mistakes and incompetence, enabled the Bolsheviks to seize power: Alexander Kerensky. I suspect that most of you are not familiar with Kerensky or know very little about him, and that is understandable. His name is perhaps only known to those who have encountered him through the Hoi4 mod Kaiserreich or the popular Oversimplified's video on the Russian Revolution. Unfortunately, this lack of recognition has rendered Kerensky somewhat irrelevant when discussing the revolution in a broader sense. Instead, most people tend to focus on the Tsar, and in doing so, overlook the crucial role that Kerensky played. It is precisely because of his perceived irrelevance that he has managed to evade responsibility for the catastrophic events that transpired. This video aims to demonstrate precisely how Kerensky's actions paved the way for the Bolsheviks to seize power. Through a thorough analysis of his decisions and their aftermath, I will show how Kerensky was solely responsible for creating the conditions that allowed Lenin and his movement to seize their chance. It is worth noting that if you believe Kerensky was incompetent based solely on Oversimplified's portrayal of him, you have not seen the full picture. Kerensky emerged as a leading figure in the February Revolution, having already gained prominence in the Duma as a vocal opponent of the monarchy. His affiliation with the Social Revolutionary Party, which was a kind of liberal socialist party, helped him maintain cordial relations with both the new government and the Petrograd Soviet. In fact, his position was so highly regarded that he was appointed as the vice chairman of the Soviet. Although Kerensky initially served as Minister of Justice in the new provisional government, he would later be reappointed as Minister of War. It was during his tenure as Minister of War that the cracks in his leadership began to show. One of Kerensky's first major decisions in this role was to enforce Order No. 1, which granted soldiers the right to express their opinions freely, abolished mandatory saluting, and mandated respectful treatment of soldiers by their officers, among other things. This decision proved to be highly controversial and had significant consequences. Order No. 1 was met with significant opposition from the officer corps of the army due to two main reasons. Firstly, it was believed that the order hampered the enforcement of discipline within the ranks of soldiers. Secondly, the soldiers' newfound right to express their opinions freely led to political agitation at the front, which the officers believed went against the army's apolitical stance. Instead of actually improving the state of the army, Order No. 1 created even more confusion among the soldiers. Kerensky's dismissal of several commanders and his replacement of General Alexeyev with General Brusilov, who had a clear revolutionary bias towards the provisional government, also contributed to the fragmentation of the military leadership. Order No. 1 proved to be a double-edged sword, as it allowed the Bolsheviks to take advantage of the political turmoil in the army. They quickly dispatched numerous agitators to the front lines, hoping to sway soldiers with their Marxist ideology. This was not an insignificant effort. The spread of Lenin's defeatist propaganda to the front further complicated Kerensky's task. Military censors began to hear the name Lenin more and more often in May 1917, not always in approving terms, but frequently enough to be of political significance. And during this time, Kerensky and Brusilov were preparing for the biggest offensive Russia had yet seen in the war, the Brusilov Offensive, targeting the area of Galicia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By carrying out this offensive, Kerensky and Brusilov hoped to gain some support for both them and the provisional government by winning this large battle. So, considering the state of political agitation at the front and how Bolshevik commissars could cause a problem during the offensive, you would think that Kerensky and Brusilov would call upon reinforcements from other parts of the empire that were not infected with Bolshevist thought, right? Wrong. They instead called upon reinforcements from the only city Bolshevism had a significant presence at, Petrograd. The arrival of Bolshevik agitators in Galicia was the worst possible news for Stavka. Already, officers were grumbling about trench Bolshevism, a lack of fighting spirit some refer to, more sourly, as skin Bolshevism. And then finally, when the Kerensky offensive was launched, you had situations like these happening. A soldier named Miroshkin in 35th Division, after his unit had captured some well-appointed Austrian trenches, convened a Soviet and shouted, "Comrades, whose land are we on anyhow? Let's give the Austrians back their land and return to our own borders. Then if they try to go further, over our dead bodies." And the fact that the offensive was going horribly did not help the situation at all, as the offensive basically killed off whatever fighting spirit had been regained by the expulsion of Bolshevist mutineers. And in the end, several divisions ended up being entirely unwilling to fight, and it was extremely difficult to expel the agitators. In theory, morale could be improved by expelling Bolshevik troublemakers from the infected units, and yet, as General Balyuev explained to Brusilov, it is impossible to expel the main agitators in view of the fact that they are armed. So, let's recap this. The Bolsheviks before were only really known in Petrograd and had almost non-existent presence in the armed forces. With Kerensky enforcing Order No. 1, he had directly allowed the Bolsheviks to send political commissars to the front in an attempt to spread their ideas. Add on to that a failed offensive that killed over 500,000 Russians, Bolshevism was now becoming a common tale among the units. And this is not the end of Kerensky's blunders. In fact, we have not even covered his biggest mistake yet. In July 1917, the Bolsheviks, feeling a bit cocky, decided to finally go through with their revolution in Petrograd, an event also known as the July Days. So important was this coup attempt to the Bolsheviks that Lenin returned from exile in Finland to take part in it, although according to witnesses, it looked as if he was down a bit. However, probably the biggest target of the July Days was Kerensky himself, with Leon Trotsky painting a giant target on his back just before the coup attempt broke out, telling his men that they should target him. Quote, Trotsky shouted out in full war cry, "Down with Kerensky," and even urged the men to kill Kerensky. End quote. All in all, the attempt of the Bolsheviks to seize power in July failed miserably, as you could imagine. Over 2,000 leading Bolsheviks were arrested in the coup attempt, and 11 Bolsheviks were charged with high treason and organizing an armed uprising. A few days after the July Days, the then Prime Minister Georgy Lvov would resign his position and choose Kerensky as his successor, arguing that, quote, "Strong government is needed, and to bring it about, a combination of elements of authority is needed, such as are embodied in the person of Kerensky. In the army, he is a recognized leader. In the country, he is a symbol of the revolution. Among the socialists, he is perhaps the only man of action. He must have the greatest freedom of action to rally everybody into one whole. in order to create that high spirit in the country which can alone save the motherland." End quote. Now, despite Lvov's praises, Kerensky was not the most popular person among the army currently. The officer corps was still furious about Order Number 1. He was universally blamed for the disastrous Kerensky offensive, and at one time he was even chased off by a mob at the Warsaw Central Station. Nevertheless, Kerensky was thrilled about his new promotion, a bit too thrilled perhaps, because the very same day he moved into the Winter Palace, sleeping on the bed of former Tsar Alexander III and also using the Tsar's train carriage for his own travels. His first order of business now as de facto dictator was to bring order to the army, and surprisingly, this time he actually did it well. He declared any withdrawal to be tantamount to treason and even reinstated the death penalty in the army, and naturally, this made a pretty strong impression on the armed forces. Now, this obviously does not really add up with his decisions as Minister of War. However, one theory I heard is that Kerensky intentionally enforced Order Number 1 in order to get the Bolsheviks a bit cocky and attempt a coup. By having Lenin show his hands, Kerensky made the Bolsheviks fall into his trap as the communists were now extremely disorganized. However, frankly, I do not believe this. I just believe that it was dumb luck for Kerensky, because his next actions doomed Russia to the grave. In an effort to try and save the army, Kerensky wanted to promote famous General Lavr Kornilov as Chief of Staff, and Kornilov would accept this position under one condition: that Order Number 1 would be abolished, and for the army to turn apolitical again. With a heavy heart, Kerensky agreed to Kornilov's demand, and 3 days later, Kornilov was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Russian armies, with Kerensky's acceptance of his terms suggesting, for socialist critics at Ispolkom, that the two men had teamed up to erode Soviet authority over the army. Now, it's important to mention that Kornilov himself was not that fond of Kerensky personally, and the same opinion goes regarding the provisional government. He would criticize Kerensky's actions numerous times, and even state how the country was going to the dogs. However, only after he reassured Kornilov that Kerensky had approved this army reform plan, Savinkov claimed in an interview conducted just days later, did Kornilov calm down. Nonetheless, he noted that, in parting, Kornilov, quote, bade me convey to Kerensky the expression of his satisfaction and the assurance of his perfect loyalty to the government. So, Kornilov's opinion towards Kerensky was not all that favorable. However, he was more than willing to cooperate if Kerensky did not interfere in the army, and just let Kornilov do his things. However, Kerensky, on the other hand, considering his position and the political climate, started getting paranoid. Kerensky began to doubt the man he had just appointed Commander-in-Chief. After the Moscow conference, he later recalled, it was clear to me that the next attempt at a blow would come from the right and not from the left. The documentary record leaves no doubt that he believed by late August 1917 that a counter-revolutionary plot was brewing. But still, both men were doing their duties, with both the political situation and that of the army starting to normalize, and the Bolsheviks were still being hunted out of Petrograd, now being completely irrelevant in the political climate. But it would take one man to destroy all of that: Vladimir Nikolaevich Lvov. What would transpire next can be explained no better than something you would see happening between three children in a preschool. Lvov was just about to be fired by Kerensky, but he had an idea up his sleeve. At around 10 p.m. on August 24th, Lvov entered Kornilov's office, and I will let Sean McMeekin take over from here. The two hit it off immediately, based on a shared antipathy to the Bolsheviks who, Kornilov informed his guest, were planning to, quote, overthrow the government. Dubiously, Lvov claimed that Kerensky had authorized him to propose 3 courses of action to see off the Bolshevik threat. Number 1, a new government with Kerensky as dictator. Number 2, a small oligarchy of 3 or 4 members to be invested with unlimited power. Or number 3, a military dictatorship under Kornilov. Without asking his mystery guest for credentials, Kornilov took Lvov's proposals as genuine and stated a preference for option 3, so long as Kerensky and Savinkov remained on as ministers. Astonishingly, Kornilov had just advocated, in effect, to overthrow the provisional government, even if under entirely false pretenses. Right after this conversation with Kornilov, Lvov set off for Petrograd to have an audience with Kerensky. And I believe you can already see where this is going. Lvov blatantly told Kerensky that General Kornilov was demanding for the provisional government to transfer all its power to the general, and that Savinkov and Kerensky must travel to Mogilev to get arrested. Obviously, Kerensky pretty much lost his mind after hearing this. But to be fair to him, he did demand to speak to Kornilov directly first before taking action. So Kerensky connected with Kornilov directly through a telegraph. This entire misunderstanding could have been solved then and there, but instead, Kerensky completely blew it. Instead, Kerensky pretended that he was Lvov and asking whether the plan should be carried out and for Kerensky and Savinkov to come to Mogilev. Kornilov had actually told Lvov that at Mogilev, Kerensky and Savinkov would be made ministers of justice and war, not arrested. But obviously, this is not what Lvov told Kerensky. And by answering yes, Kornilov had just fallen into Kerensky's trap. Believing that a right-wing military coup was imminent, Kerensky called an emergency cabinet meeting at midnight. Savinkov, to his immense credit, tried to talk him down, viewing the whole Kornilov business as a fatal misunderstanding, not a conspiracy. But Kerensky was having none of it. He proclaimed melodramatically, "I will not let them have the revolution." In a curious mirror imaging of what he claimed Kornilov was doing, Kerensky asked for and was granted dictatorial powers. Soon enough, Kerensky would place all of Petrograd under martial law and demanded that Kornilov be arrested at once. When Kornilov heard about everything, he was more than furious. In his own radio reply to the country, Kornilov finally admitted what truly happened and saw this as a great provocation. Kornilov then continued, based on Kerensky's dishonorable accusation, stated that the government was acting under Bolshevik pressure and that they managed to infiltrate the government. Kornilov would then conclude his message with, quote, "I, General Kornilov, son of a Cossack peasant, declare to all and sundry that I want nothing for myself except the preservation of a great Russia, and I vow to bring the people by any means of victory over the enemy to the Constituent Assembly." End quote. By this point, Kornilov was actually still going through with his coup attempt, not because he was actually trying to go against Kerensky, but because, as I mentioned, he believed that the government was taken over by the Bolsheviks and that Kerensky was being pressured into giving out these orders, and the political fallout was devastating. The Kornilov Affair, born in misunderstanding, was now poisoned by bad faith. After reading Kornilov's reply, Kerensky must have realized the mistake both men had made in trusting Lvov. Instead, he doubled down, accusing Kornilov in a follow-up communique of treachery. But the worst was yet to come. In an effort to halt Kornilov's coup, Kerensky had released all imprisoned Bolsheviks and their leaders in order to form a, quote, "committee for the people's struggle against counter-revolution." By doing this, Kerensky officially gave the Bolsheviks amnesty and even supplied them with guns. Overall, Kornilov's rebellion and coup attempt was very short-lived, as he surrendered a couple of days later at Mogilev and was subsequently imprisoned. Kerensky obviously saw this as a huge victory for the revolution, but unknowingly to him, he had just put the final nail in the coffin for Russia. You see, now that Kornilov was gone, Kerensky needed a new chief of staff, and he sent out requests to numerous Russian generals to see if they would accept the role, but every single general declined his offer. First, it was Order Number 1, and then after that, the Kornilov Affair. The army's allegiance to Kerensky virtually collapsed in every way. General Alexander Lukomsky was one of the people that this position was offered to. He obviously declined, but in the meantime also told Kerensky that, quote, "The firing of Kornilov will lead to horrors such as Russia has not yet experienced." End quote. So, in order to eliminate a threat that basically never existed, and through his own actions, Kerensky had sacked one of the most competent men in the army, subsequently losing the entire support of the armed forces. And worst of all, in order to fight this phantom menace of Kornilovism, Kerensky had released the Bolsheviks from prison, granted them amnesty, and also supplied them with weapons. The same group who attempted a coup back in July and called for Kerensky to be killed. Honestly, even I have no idea what to say about this. This sounds like something you would hear in a cartoon. And Kerensky himself was just realizing what his actions meant for Russia. When Kornilov was appointed as chief of staff, the situation of the military began to rapidly improve. Discipline was returned to the front, more authority was given to the officers, and so on. But most importantly, Major General M.A. Svechin reported on July 28th that planned political agitation had ceased entirely owing to the crackdown on the Bolsheviks, with the voices of more patriotic socialist revolutionaries now dominating soldiers' committees. Every achievement the Bolsheviks managed to make with agitators thanks to Order Number 1 was entirely crushed with Kornilov's efforts, and Bolshevik influence in the army became non-existent. Kerensky and Kornilov were working side by side to eradicate remaining Bolshevik influence in Russia, and it was working. But now with the aftermath of the Kornilov affair, the army became completely demoralized, because considering how many times Kerensky changed the structure of the army, no one knew for who they were fighting now. A more common reaction was a fatalistic shrug of shoulders, as men wondered, why should we fight now? Summing up the feelings of many, one Muscovite enlistee declared, "This is not a war, this is the annihilation of the Russian nation." And now with the Bolsheviks being granted complete amnesty, the Bolshevization of the army continued, with even more agitators being sent. And of course, Kerensky did nothing to stop them, in an effort to try and appease them. Bolshevik commissars managed to seize control of the telegraph apparatus and were now vetting all communication towards Petrograd. And on the other side, well, no one was even leading the fight against Bolshevism, just a loose coalition of anyone who was opposed to them. Kerensky should have been the one to lead it, but after alienating the entire army and pretty much everyone who was on the right of the Mensheviks, he became a leader without followers. But this was not the end of Kerensky's blunders. Soon enough, the Okhrana, Russia's counterintelligence agency, came to Kerensky with a massive breakthrough. After a morning search in one of the mansions, they found countless documents, maps, list of regiments involved, all connected to the Bolsheviks on seizing power and overthrowing the government. This was all Kerensky needed. With this amount of evidence, he could finally go through with a treason trial against the Bolsheviks and end their movement for good. But what did Kerensky instead do? He abolished the Okhrana, right after they unearthed this massive amount of evidence. Kerensky decided to let the Bolsheviks off the hook as to fight the phantom menace of Kornilovism, and then abolished the very counterintelligence department that had unearthed the evidence. Stunningly, Kerensky even allowed the Bolsheviks to rearm, ostensibly to help defend Petrograd against Kornilovites, his idea being, apparently, that the Bolshevik military organization was the only experienced armed force available. The Bolsheviks promptly seized 40,000 rifles from a government arsenal. What on earth was Kerensky thinking? And then, shocking literally no one, the next month the Bolsheviks finally launched their revolution, now fully armed. Kerensky immediately requested for nearby troops to head to Petrograd to quash the insurrection. But this time, Kerensky's past actions finally came back to haunt him. Kerensky's urgent request for loyal troops to reinforce the capital, wired to Northern Front headquarters at Pskov, was simply ignored by the new front commander, General Chereshimov, who tossed the order over to his aide and said, quote, "This is political and has nothing to do with me." In the looming struggle between the Bolsheviks and Kerensky's government, Russia's officers had no dog in the fight. Keep in mind, out of 160,000 soldiers present in Petrograd, only 10,000 were taking part in the October Revolution. In comparison, Kerensky's loyalists numbered less than 2,500, and in the face of the Bolsheviks, were completely outnumbered. And this is why it was easy for the Bolsheviks to take power. Had any division responded to Kerensky's plea for help, the October Revolution would have been dealt with then and there. But instead, karma finally caught up to Kerensky, and realizing everything was lost, he got into a car and drove out of Petrograd, leaving the city to completely fall to the Bolsheviks. It is extremely clear that the Bolshevik takeover was not the case of a popular uprising. Rather, as I mentioned previously, Lenin got extremely lucky with the way the provisional government was being run, especially by Alexander Kerensky. The amount of mistakes he made during his tenure doomed Russia for Bolshevism, as I have shown. He was the one who directly contributed to their rise to power without even realizing. And if he did at least one thing right here, the October Revolution would have most likely never happened, or would have gone completely differently. To attribute the revolution solely to the Tsar would be ludicrous. Had Nicholas remained in power during the crucial events, the Bolsheviks would not have had the opportunity to seize power. However, it was the actions of one man, Alexander Kerensky, that ultimately disrupted the course of events. His remarkable incompetence and failure to anticipate the consequences of his actions played a pivotal role in paving the way for the Bolsheviks to take power. Kerensky emerges as a central figure during the February Revolution, deserving significant blame for the Bolsheviks' rise and their subsequent influence over nearly a decade of Russian history.